Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be recapping all of the things we've done to this BMW 1 Series over the past 4 years and why it has been sitting here in this very sad state for so long. Just like everything in life, this car was definitely not planned. Originally, I was building an engine to go into my little E36 drift car, then realized that we were going to be making a whole lot of power, and we started looking for diffs and drive shafts to strengthen up the rear end. Unfortunately, there was nothing available, or at least there was some aftermarket stuff available. However, very expensive, hard to fit, a lot of fabrication was required, and didn't really fit in with that seat time car approach. So I started to look for a replacement for our E36 BMW. Originally, it was going to get a 3 Series BMW 2010. However, my neighbor had a little 1 Series sitting out the front, and when I questioned him about it, he told me it was for sale. It was manual, it had a blown engine, and when I asked him how much he wanted for it, he said, "Give me the money that the wreckers are going to pay him for the car," and it was mine. So this was the car that started everything, but little did I know the path I was about to take. So the idea was finally spawned that the 1 Series was going to be our chassis of choice. However, a hatch, not very cool, is it? So of course, it was back to Facebook Marketplace to find ourselves a 2-door. So now we have a 2-door 1 Series BMW, which runs all the same suspension geometry and engines and transmissions as you would find in your 3 Series, just with a bit of a shorter wheelbase. So when this car was first purchased, the front chassis rails were cut off the front. So of course, first step was to find a donor car. A quick search on Facebook Marketplace again, and we found a rolling shell. We needed to harvest a new front subframe and the new straight chassis rails. For those of you keeping up, that is the 5th 1 Series BMW it's taken us to get to here. So we chopped it up as soon as it came and harvested all the straight rails and subframes to use in the coupe. First, I removed the front subframe and got to work cutting off those rails. I went a little bit further back than I needed to, just in case we were to encounter a similar issue a little bit later on down the track and we had the parts to replace. Now was the do or die moment for this build. Removing the damaged subframe and assessing the damage to the chassis rails. It was not looking good. The issue was that the damage was near the pickup point for the front subframe bolts. The only way we could know if the chassis was not bent would be to install the new one and hope for the best. If the subframe didn't align, then we would have needed to send the chassis off to the frame shop for straightening or completely scrap the build altogether. Luckily, it slipped straight on. There was a little bit of damage remaining in the lower section of the rail. However, with a small hammer, it was easily persuaded back into its place. Now that we had our spare parts for the chassis rails, it was time to take them apart. First, I started by taking some measurements of the car and determined how much of the rail I needed. Using a method I saw on YouTube, I got to drilling out all the spot welds and removed the sections of chassis rails that we required. Then, took those parts, got them ready to be welded onto the new chassis. I reinstalled all the front panels and radiator supports of the car to align the chassis rails, measured across several points left to right just to make sure it was all square before we started welding everything back together. both rails are now back in place. So could also do with a little bit of grinding and smoothing and cleaning out. Just giving that a little bit of a spray over with black so it doesn't rust. So when I say this car was stripped, I was not over exaggerating. We struggled to find a bolt left on this car outside of what was holding in our subframes. So between all the spare cars, the one that I just had, any interior bits that were left here, we managed to actually get a full interior together. We started by installing the dash support bar and the dash skin. Center console, because who doesn't need cup holders while they're at a drift event? Then followed by the door trims and the door seals. I know a lot of people who like to remove door cards, however, that's not the look we're going for. I wanted it to feel more like a street car turned drift car. Next up, we needed to install the engine and gearbox to make sure they would fit into the chassis. Usually, these cars come with a BMW N54 or N55 engine, which is quite a bit larger, so I was hoping this engine will fit without too many modifications. The engine itself is out of a BMW E36, comprising of a cast iron block from a 1992 model BMW, coupled with a 1998 model head from an engine called the M52. The crank is out of a 2.8 litre, which is a forged item, and we're using the connecting rods from a non-Vanos engine. Coupled with all the good bits to make the engine reliable, such as Cometic head gaskets and ARP head studs. Also some extensive porting to the exhaust ports, as the newer the engines became, the smaller the ports would get. I'll add a link to the video for those of you who are interested in watching the whole engine build itself. Of course, this engine never came in this chassis, so we had to make our own custom engine mounts. So using some tube steel, we made some top hats for the factory engine mounts and mated them to some 10mm thick plates bolted to the side of the engine. Making sure they were strong to withstand the stress of drifting, we added in some bracing, and the last thing we need is a broken engine mount. After some careful measuring and chopping for clearance, the engine is in its final location, ensuring enough clearance underneath for movement, and of course allowing the bonnet, hood if you're from America, to close. We also needed to equate for the power steering pump, as it sits quite low at the front of the engine. I've used a pump from the newer BMW and mated it to the older style engine. The newer style pump is regularly available online and all round a better unit. We may look at changing over to an electric power steering rack if we run into engine problems in the future. Next, I switched over to preparing the intake manifold. Because we're moving over to forced induction, there were some changes that had to be made. We had to simplify the vacuum system by removing a whole lot of valves off the side of the intake and make a stronger mount for the idle valve. This would stop the idle valve from blowing out when the engine was under boost. Speaking of boost, it was time to figure out what size turbo was going to fit. I had two options, a Holsett HX30 turbo. This was off a diesel generator, and a GT3582 from the Ford Barra engine. After checking the space I had available, it was clear to see that the Garrett was better suited for our application. Again, this turbo is very easily available, and if anything were to happen, we could get a replacement quite quickly and cheaply. To prepare the manifold, I needed to bolt it in place and weld on the flange for the T3 turbo. There are a lot of things which need to be taken into account when deciding where to place your turbo. Firstly, you want to have the oil feed and drain lines in the vertical location and keep the water lines as far away from the exhaust housing as possible. Next, you need to take into account the exhaust pipe and general clearances around the turbo, as the engine does move around a lot. As the angle of this engine has been changed, it has allowed for a lot more room to mount the turbo and necessary hardware. I bolted the T3 flange to the bottom of the turbo, and once I was happy with the location, I tacked and welded it in place. I took the manifold over to the workbench and we added a few pieces of extra tubing to close up the gaps. If you want to watch the full video on that, I'll link it in the description. The turbo we used to mock up the exhaust manifold needs a rebuild, so we'll be covering that whole process in the next video. We'll also be going over the costs of what it's taken to get the vehicle here thus far. So if you could please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.